Welcome, everyone, to our second session of our six-segment series on economy, climate, and community. I hope many of you had a chance to join us for our first session 3 weeks ago with Jeff Sachs. We had an exciting, provocative, great launch to this conversation about how is it that the economy is currently driving climate change, and how can we redirect the economy to actually help solve this major crisis and challenge that we face. We're excited to launch this second segment today, which is really going to focus in on the relationship between the economy and energy systems, one of the themes that we're highlighting in this series. This will be the second segment of six, as I mentioned. In July, we'll hear from Kate Raworth, one of the leading economists thinking about redistributive economies. In August, we'll be focusing on the role of economy and ecosystems and have a great session with John Liu. In September, we have our own Joe Neguse, Congressman Joe Neguse, a rising star in the Democratic Party and a real leader in thinking about policy that helps drive the economy towards solutions. And finally, in a session that I think many of us are looking forward to in October, we have science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, who's just written the book Ministry for the Future, coming in to think about with us, how do we imagine the future that we really want here? So before we get started, I just want to also thank our co-sponsors to this event, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, our very own and dearly loved county, who often partners with us on these kinds of things, and the Council on World Affairs. And then we have this terrific production support from the Bioneers team. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague and the director of the Climate Initiatives Department in Boulder, Jonathan Cohen.
Great. Thank you, Brett. And I just realized that we are both sharing this kind of virtual space hovering above our wastewater treatment plant and solar panels below. So how interesting. Again, nice to see everybody, meet everybody. I'm Jonathan Cohen, again, the acting director of the Climate Initiatives Department for the city of Boulder, and have the honor to virtually welcome you to our beautiful city. So we are excited to have you here with us for what is an important discussion on a major driver of climate change, fossil fuel finance. So as Brett mentioned, today's event is just one of 6 webinars taking place as part of this Boulder Forum. And really in launching this series, we hope to spark what is a broader conversation about what cities can do and what we are doing to shape an economy in service of an equitable climate stabilization. So just a couple remarks here. I'm sure many of you are aware, one of the emerging areas of global climate action has been efforts to reallocate investments away from carbon-intensive fossil fuels and into renewable energy-based systems. So we've seen increasingly successful divestment campaigns encouraging, say, major institutions, from universities to religious organizations to Fortune 500 companies to cities to divest their interest in polluting fossil fuels. It's interesting to me because more and more we're hearing about the issues of where, when, and how the climate moral imperative is going to intersect with business opportunities. It's happening every day. It's happening already. And of course, with huge investments in renewable energy and battery storage and EVs. And at the city level, there's been this growing discussion on the investment needed for strategies such as widespread electrification of heat and transportation, which I think is a prominent area for investors. I would argue that any wise fossil fuel industry executive thinking about where to invest capital in the next year, 5 years, or decade is facing some pretty important signals, to say the least. The long-term trend suggests that these companies really have to rapidly build up their portfolios of low carbon and zero carbon projects if they want to stay profitable in a net zero world. So I'm also really heartened because there are some extremely important signals coming from the federal level, which we'll get into in our discussions today. So during the Leaders Summit on Climate, President Biden released the U.S. International Climate Finance Plan, which signals that the U.S. intends to drive forward efforts to end international official financing for carbon-intensive fossil-based energy. And just about a month ago, the president issued an executive order on climate-related financial risk, which really makes clear that financial regulators should take on climate, including the risks financial institutions create by financing fossil fuels in excess of science-based climate targets. So, how is our economy perpetuating carbon-based energy systems? And what are the major shifts that we need to facilitate, that global we? Well, thankfully, we have just the right people to talk about that issue. So I'm going to stop and introduce our speakers. First up is Lolita Jackson. Lolita is the former special advisor for climate policy and programs in the New York City Mayor's office. She is the city, or was the city's diplomat for climate change, which is a really cool title, by the way. She was a key figure in the development and implementation of New York City's energy transition strategy. And I also want to highlight her role with the management team of the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency, which produced New York City's first resiliency plan. I told her before we got on that she is one of the very few people that I notoriously stalk on social media. So someday, Lolita, you and I are going to talk about your love of penguins, by the way. Speaking alongside Lolita, we are so fortunate to have a Cornell University professor of law, Robert Hockett. Robert, as many of you know, quite literally wrote the book on financing the Green New Deal. And since 2019, he's been serving as an advisor to Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the Green New Deal. So here's how we're going to set this up. Both Lolita and Robert are each going to speak for roughly 10 minutes or so. We're going to get into some Q&A. What I would ask all of you participants, please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A tool to enter any questions that you might have. And then our team is going to be sifting through the themes, sharing your questions later in the session. So before I hand the Zoom mic over to Lolita, our plan is to wrap up around 12:45-ish. Hopefully most of you can stick around for part 2, where we are going to be joined by Colorado State Senator and Senator Majority Leader Steve Fenberg to continue this thread on a more localized scale. Okay, so thank you again to our panelists, to all of you for taking the time to join us today. We're glad to have you here with us. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Lolita to kick things off.
Thank you so much. So as Jonathan said, my name is Lolita Jackson, and I'm really pleased to be asked to speak during this session. So as he said, I'm the Executive Director of Communications and Sustainable Cities for Sustainable Development Capital, LLP, which is a $1 billion London-based climate finance and investment firm. But until March 11th of this year, I worked for the New York City Mayor's office for 15 years and was the climate diplomat for the city, responsible for working with governments around the world to share best practices on climate, as well as being part of policy teams and in leadership for New York City's series of climate plans. In addition to the plan that Jonathan just spoke about, which was our resilience plan after Hurricane Sandy, I also worked on every climate plan New York City has done, as we are mandated every 4 years to do a new climate plan, starting with Plan YC in 2007. So I'm very proud of that history of working on climate. I worked directly with UN colleagues to ensure that local government had a voice in all sorts of fora, including the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow, which we'll talk about a bit later. I was also one of the leads for New York City's work on divestment and investing in climate solutions. I thought I'd spend a few minutes today discussing some salient points about how money can affect climate mitigation planning and success in some ways that you don't even realize. First, New York City is committed to divestment from fossil fuels. During my tenure at the New York City Mayor's office, New York City was actually one of the leads alongside London of the Divest Invest Forum, which is part of C40, where global cities joined to learn more about divestment and investment in sustainable solutions. Cities such as Milan, Bristol, Cape Town, and Vancouver are all members. New York City's pension funds voted to divest $4 billion from fossil fuels, and Mayor de Blasio committed to make pensions carbon neutral by 2040. And also to increase investments in climate solutions to $50 billion by 2035. New York City also led a resolution in the US Conference of Mayors that passed about a year ago now, June 30th last year, where a number of key cities, both red and blue, committed to looking at divestment for fossil fuels. These commitments have all been instrumental in getting other cities to consider similar actions. Divestment is a tool in the arsenal to limit the influence of fossil fuel companies in the overall economy. Fossil fuel companies have been the recipients of tax subsidies, loans, and direct federal funding that have helped to prop up and sustain this asset category for many years. The federal government has a long history of intervening in energy markets, evidenced in the numerous subsidies in the US tax code to promote and facilitate the production of cheap energy. Conservative estimates put US direct subsidies to the fossil fuel industry at roughly $20 billion a year, with 20% currently allocated to coal and 80% to natural gas and crude oil. European Union subsidies are estimated to total 55 billion euros annually. This is according to the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. The latest IMF report estimates that $5.2 trillion was spent globally on fossil fuel subsidies in 2017, a $500 billion increase since 2015. The largest subsidies were provided by China, the US, and Russia. According to the IMF, fossil fuels account for 85% of all global subsidies. In addition to subsidies, there's also definite protectionism. On April 6th, Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon created a $1.2 million fund to support a program tasked with protecting the state's coal industry by suing states that are blocking the use of coal. The fund marks the latest effort to protect Wyoming's coal industry, which accounts for approximately 40% of the nation's total. Another item I'd like to discuss is the impact of economic policies on what we might otherwise think of as our personal choices. Government subsidies for agriculture, such as corn or beef, sometimes result in artificially low prices for non-sustainably farmed food. This keeps many food prices low when compared to organic or vegan alternatives. In particular, in many poorer neighborhoods, it is much cheaper to eat processed or fast food than it is to eat healthy foods, fruits, and vegetables. This is a particular scenario where it literally does not pay to do the right thing, and has contributed to rising obesity rates among our young people in particular. So there's a direct link to that, to the living conditions in some of these communities. Government subsidies for airlines also help keep the price of flying low and are another example of economic policies hurting the cause of climate change. Last year, the airline industry received $25 billion in federal subsidies, and this has an overall cost to the environment, as you can imagine. Where I'm currently sitting in London, I'm at my company's headquarters this week, it is the same price to fly as to take the train. For a hypothetical journey from London to Edinburgh and back for the identical dates and times, an EasyJet flight is 106 pounds, but a nonstop train is 116 pounds. No wonder so many Europeans jet all over. These pricing schemes cannot continue if we want to encourage people to do less flying on a whim. As a final example, Americans purchase 5 times as much clothing as we did in 1980. Much of this is due to the rise in the fast fashion industry, which basically produces garments overseas for sale in the US and does so for extremely low prices. This encourages wastefulness by the consumer as the supply of inexpensive and stylish clothing is limitless. It also harms the environment by the distances that these garments travel. Practices need to be put in place to discourage this, and a number of cities are already looking at this issue through circular economy and other lenses. To think about how all this comes together, we must look at environmental justice more broadly. Many of the worst effects of climate change happen to the people on the lowest rungs of society. 50% of all children in one neighborhood of New York City, East Harlem, have asthma due to the placement of bus depots, truck routes, and more throughout their area. Those same neighborhoods are often food deserts, where there's a dearth of fruits and vegetables, or the prices are so high and price of fast food such as McDonald's and Popeyes so low that it's hard for the available healthy foods to even compete. In addition, fast fashion stores where a piece of clothing is a cheaper price and the low quality is irrelevant, so the wearer doesn't mind paying another $8 in a month or two for a replacement, versus paying twice as much and having it last for much longer time, are ubiquitous. All of these economic issues play out in low-income neighborhoods and are not theoretical discussions. The macro level items I discussed earlier happen in real time in these neighborhoods. We must tackle and address them in order to have true ability to meet the overall climate goal of limiting to 1.5. And we have to make it real to people. I haven't grown up in a similar economic situation where I grew up in housing projects and had hand-me-down clothes. I do not blame the people who partake whatsoever. The system is set up for people to participate in exactly this manner. The important thing to do is to do something about changing the incentives and thus the economics. Those of us who are doing the important climate work on the local level can help change this. We should continue to talk about these things in public spaces and also work together on implementation of practical solutions. I know Boulder and many other cities are considering some of these issues. I look forward to further discussion later in the program. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, Lolita, thank you so much. I am going to practice some serious self-restraint, which is really hard for me because I have about 100 questions for you. First of all, I really appreciate how you brought in some of these non-traditional policies and practices, because I think generally our minds go right to where you started, which is the fossil fuel subsidies and what are the economic drivers with respect to the industry, and some of those policies and the connection between our food systems and our clothing systems and transportation. That is some really cool stuff to be thinking about. I'm really eager to get into that in some of the Q&A. I'm going to do this though, because I will just keep riffing as long as and drive people away. So I'm just going to hand the mic right over to Robert. Let's go to you, and then let's regroup when you're done, and we'll dig into some of the Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. It's really an honor to be part of this and to be appearing with Lolita in particular. So I thought what I would just do is sort of stick to or kind of turn over to the sort of business side of things on the one hand, and also to some sort of positive developments that we can kind of lever or sort of capitalize on when it comes to environmental justice and environmental mitigation on the other hand. So let me start with my sort of financial regulatory scholars hat, and note that one of the sort of principles, well, let's put it this way. One way to look at some of what Lolita just told you is that we actually tend to sort of stack the deck currently through policy of various kinds and through expenditures, public expenditures of various kinds, to stack the deck in favor of planetary devastation and eco-unfriendly practices, most notably quite notably fossil fuel production and burning, excessive manufacturing of cheap clothing, and the like. And then, of course, we also tend to encourage the externalization of these particular harms that are caused by these kinds of practices, especially onto traditionally disadvantaged communities or communities that have been exploited and treated unjustly for decades, if not indeed centuries. So the first thing to note is that there is some real hope now that some of that is going to change. In other words, that we're actually going to sort of stop some of the kinds of deck stacking on behalf of or in favor of planetarily destructive behavior and climate injustice. And one particular realm that I've been sort of focused on a bit, again, in my role as a finance regulation scholar, is when it comes to actually assigning risk to particular entities that are themselves partly responsible for the kinds of injustices and planetary endangerment that Lolita just mentioned and that we're all kind of here to talk about. So as a lot of you guys know, and as Lolita herself mentioned, and as Brett mentioned as well, there is a tendency, right, for large financial institutions in particular, for banks among them, but other kinds of financial institutions as well, to finance and make quite easy the continuation of environmentally devastating practices and environmentally unjust practices, and not to face any particular consequences for this, because basically they continue to have rather easy access to the capital markets. They tend to be able still to borrow quite cheaply and to attract investment quite cheaply. And one of the things that enables them to do this is precisely the fact that they're not forced to sort of internalize the costs that they impose on others or the risks that they impose on others. And that is something that is now in the midst of changing, right? On the one hand, there is the Biden administration report that was just mentioned a few minutes ago, but there are sort of similar efforts underway as well. As you guys probably know, central banks worldwide, now finally including the Fed as well, are looking into essentially adding in or building in to their risk models when it comes to sort of determining how much risk attaches to investment in a particular institution. Also, when it comes to sort of developing their so-called stress test models, which are concerned with the vulnerability of particular financial institutions to environmental catastrophes or other sorts of disasters, to sort of including in those assessments and stress tests and risk assignment or risk weight assignments, exposure to planetary endangerment, to climate risk, to climate disaster. This is partly a function in turn of the fact that the law itself is now evolving to make it more possible or make it easier or at least less difficult for those who are harmed by environmental impacts to actually hold those who finance those impacts accountable in courts. So I think, are likely to see in the very near future a significant increase in the cost of capital to businesses that themselves either cause environmental devastation or environmental risk, or that finance, right, the sort of aid or facilitate the kinds of behaviors or activities that actually cause that kind of harm. So that's the first point, the first sort of bit of good news that's kind of operating at the federal level and also at the international level, that is going to have an impact in Boulder in a very specific way that I'll get to in just a moment. First, however, one more big bit of news that is also going to have an important impact on Boulder that Boulder can then respond to, or is going to have an impact on business that Boulder can then respond to. And that is, of course, the Green New Deal itself, or Building Back Better. I actually think the way Building Back Better is turning out to be, or coming to be elaborated, that it basically is a kind of repackaging of, or a rebranding of the Green New Deal itself. I mean, previously, I think there was probably a misconception. It didn't look like one at the time, but it does now in retrospect, that Building Back Better was going to be a kind of more modest, a somewhat humbler or less ambitious rendition of the Green New Deal. So, Bernie, ambition, Green New Deal; Biden, Build Back Better, less ambition. But in fact, happily, it looks as though Mr. Biden is turning out to be quite ambitious when it comes to Building Back Better. Whether Joe Manchin can be brought on board is another question. But in any event, it's looking as though at least the aspiration behind Building Back Better is similar to that behind the Green New Deal. And here's why that's important, or what sort of renders both of them sort of unique relative to previous efforts to mitigate environmental damage and to reverse environmental damage and actually save the planet. In the past, most proposals in this particular space have been about prohibitions of various kinds, or sort of quasi-prohibitions like cap and trade, right? So sort of prohibit the use of certain materials or fuels that add carbon to the atmosphere, or place some kind of cap on the total that's allowed, and then allow people to trade permits so that they can, purchase more rights to pollute if other people relinquish more rights to pollute, which I'm not here to diss in any way. Those were efforts that looked to be the most that could be done back when they were current. But the thing about that really makes the Green New Deal, I think, and then ultimately Building Back Better as well, unique, is they're basically combining the urgent need, or sort of recognition of the urgent need to rescue the planet on the one hand, with the urgent need to revitalize, reestablish, rejuvenate the nation's infrastructural and industrial base on the other. In other words, a phrase that was kind of out of date as recently as a couple of years ago, industrial policy, is suddenly coming to be in vogue again. And it's very easy to sort of merge the growing interest or recognition of the urgent importance of a revival of industrial policy with a growing interest in and revival of concern about planetary destruction. Because as it happens, all new state-of-the-art infrastructures and all new state-of-the-art productive techniques and technologies are, in effect, by definition, green. In other words, if you're going to go modern, if you're going to modernize when it comes to productive activity and when it comes to infrastructure replacement, you are per force, in a sense, going to be going greener. And what that means in turn then is that environmental rescue and planetary rescue can be recast as business opportunities in addition to being urgent necessities. Now, there is a danger in this, of course. We don't want to hand it over to private sector interests, because we know that private sector interests are what got us into the terrible messes that we're in right now in the first place. And there's no reason to assume right off the bat that it's going to be any different if we hand over sort of decision-making authority and the like to businesses. Basically, the public sector has to be firmly in the driver's seat throughout any kind of Green New Deal or Building Back initiative or effort. However, the sense in which it's nevertheless helpful that these are business opportunities is that it's possible now to offer carrots in addition to sticks to private sector interests when it comes to rescuing the planet. because in effect, what we can sort of push for and what we can see or imagine happening is all sorts of programs that are adopted at the federal level that essentially provide all sorts of incentives and also investment capital, public investment capital, to sort of partner up with private investment capital to develop the industries of tomorrow and the infrastructures of tomorrow, many of which are going to provide very lucrative new construction jobs, other kinds of jobs that aren't readily exported, that can reindustrialize the country and bring back something like a semblance of a middle class, but now in an ethnically and racially more just manner than was done in the past. And it can all, in that sense, sort of be cast again as a kind of positive thing where we're upgrading and we're all about sort of, not only thou shalt nots, and not only thou shalts, but also would you like to, or how about this, right? So that's another sort of important change, I think, that's underway right now that is of significance worldwide and nationally, but also to Boulder in particular. And that takes me to the final point I wanted to make, and that's a Boulder specific point. So a big part of both the Green New Deal as we imagined it or envisaged it in 2018 and the lead up to the actual drafting of and passing of, not passing, but submission of the resolution in Congress in early 2019, and also a big part of the vision behind Building Back Better is that localities, cities, towns, states, regions are going to play a very important role in determining what kinds of Green New Deal or Building Back Better projects are most urgently needed in their particular areas, right? Because it's a big country, it's a continent spanning country. The particular threats to the environment tend to differ from region to region and from town to town. The most urgent environmental needs tend to differ from town to town and the like. And so in a sense, we can say that, okay, the localities are best situated to determine where we most need to do what when it comes to building back better or when it comes to putting in place a Green New Deal. On the other hand, the disadvantage that's faced by localities and states for that matter is they don't have the kind of access to the capital markets and to the capacity to tax that the federal government has. So the federal government has essentially the comparative advantage when it comes to coordinating, to making sure that local projects aren't at cross purposes with one another, and when it comes to funding, whereas the localities inherently have the advantage when it comes to determining what most urgently needs to be done where. Now, what that means in turn is that the Green New Deal and or Building Back Better are going to function largely in the following way. Federal funding will be increasingly available to assist localities and states with Building Back Better projects, but the feds will rely on and need localities and the states to determine what they most need to spend that kind of money on. So a kind of second plank or a sort of second wave strategy behind the Green, sort of in connection with the Green New Deal that we've been pushing since later 2019, and which I think is only going to gather steam going forward, is what I dubbed the Green New Deal wish list project, but we can also call it the Building Back Better wish list project. The idea here is to have regular town hall meetings, regular city council meetings, regular meetings with involving as many residents and stakeholders as possible on a locality by locality basis to determine, right, what most needs to be done given that additional federal funding or additional public-private combined funding will be forthcoming. And so one way to sort of open up a meeting of this sort is to say, look, think of it as almost like a Christmas list, right? Or another holiday list, when at least for a holiday when gifts are given. Imagine that somebody comes in from the federal government and says, there's going to be X amount of money available to you guys for particular projects. Where do you think that money would be best spent? Well, it's kind of a nice challenge to be faced with, isn't it? It's kind of a nice quote unquote problem to have to come up with some projects or some a kind of priority list of what's most in need of additional federal funding. So what I'll close with is a kind of admonition or recommendation or an enthusiastic urging that Boulder, like other cities, get to the task of beginning to hold community meetings, beginning to deliberate publicly at the local level as soon as possible about what the priorities should be on the premise that there's going to be a lot more federal funding coming your way or becoming available to fund projects than has previously been. And many of these projects could end up being quite beneficial to local businesses as well. So if you have local business and local residents all together taking part in these sort of town hall wish list meetings, you're likely to get a much better Building Back Better or Green New Deal outcome than you would otherwise get. So I'll close there for now, and I'm just looking forward to a more wide-ranging discussion. Thanks again.
Robert, thank you so much. I'm sitting here furiously taking notes, thinking how to best organize what I just heard from you. And I want to start with a couple of responses and reflections. And I have a really pointed question that I want to get back to with Lolita. But first of all, I just want to really appreciate some of the framing that you provided, that you both provided, specifically as you started with a little bit of hope. And the reason that I say that, Robert, is that I think it's very easy. We all sit in a lot of these types of webinars and discussions, and we focus on the problems, and we forget that there is a lot of progress being made. I often say that one of the most powerful and insidious forces we face in this issue of global climate change is resignation. And that is this numb acceptance that we can't change things. And so pointing out and highlighting some of the progress that's being made, I think, is incredibly important as we move forward. So I really appreciated how you recast some of the business opportunities and the causation issues. I want to dig in a little bit with the first question and weave in a question that we had in the chat from my colleague at Boulder County. And it's digging into this issue of building back better and thinking about how cities and looking at our participants. There's a lot of city representatives today on the webinar, thinking about how cities like Boulder prepare for federal climate spending. And what I mean by that is that I think that you given some really good advice on how we might set up a functional process to be able to identify specific projects that could be good recipients for federal dollars. But I want to point out this interesting asymmetry that is emerging where I think there are a lot of local needs that can be identified, but I think jurisdictions are really eager to play a larger role in influencing what's happening as the federal government is mobilizing trillions of dollars. And so I'm wondering if there's some examples on strategies that we might want to be thinking about that could scale. What are those top priority actions that cities could be taking that both provide local benefits, but also help shift our financial structure and policies?
I'm sort of here, I'm trying to be sort of politically savvy with an eye to what looks likely to play out in Washington. And nobody's ever accused me of being especially savvy before. So do take this with a grain of salt. But it looks to me as though if we're actually going to get serious additional green infrastructure spending out of DC, it's going to require probably getting the go-ahead from people like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. Now, that's overall, I think that's sort of unfortunate news. I wish I could say that's good news, but it's not. But it's not necessarily as bad a bit of bad news as it might otherwise have been. What it might end up meaning is that what we end up getting is essentially approval for appropriations for quote unquote traditional infrastructures rather than non-traditional infrastructures, which on the one hand is bad news because there's an awful lot of infrastructure now that wouldn't have been recognized as infrastructure 20 or 30 years ago, just like, interstate highways wouldn't have been infrastructure in the 1914, 17 era, right? When all we have is US highways. But that doesn't mean that these can't be green, environmentally friendly, environmentally sustainable, and environmentally justice sensitive projects, right? So for example, if there is a particular power plant that is coal fired or petroleum fired or the like, and it's located in an area where lots of waste is as usual, finding its way to traditionally exploited communities, then if you decided, okay, we're going to replace that with a clean energy facility that doesn't actually pollute at all, and certainly and take special care not to pollute communities that have been traditionally harmed or exploited, that's still going to count as traditional, right? At least in the relevant sense, because the way people like Manchin and Sinema and then Republicans are defining traditional here doesn't necessarily have to mean traditional in the sense that, well, it uses traditional energy sources. It's rather defined in more functional terms, like, well, it's a traditional function to provide power, right? Or it's a traditional function to provide transportation networks or whatever. So what I would suggest, just given the way things are looking in Washington at this point, and hence the way it's, what it's looking like is apt to pass and what it's looking like is not apt to pass, a good strategy probably for all towns and cities, Boulder included, is to look especially at traditional infrastructure areas or fields, so to speak, and then look at those particular examples that are the most problematic, both from an environmental justice point of view and from an environmental sustainability point of view, and think of whether there might be ways to replace those particular infrastructures and accomplish the particular or fulfill the functions that they fulfill in cleaner, greener ways. Then I think a sizable bit of federal funding might very well be available very soon.
Just to add to his answer very quickly, because the company I work for now, I haven't talked about it much, but we only invest in climate solutions and climate investments. So one of our investments is called Primary Energy that deals with a U.S. steel plant. So I would say if you put in procurement that steel or cement, wherever you're procuring that from has to be done in a cleaner way, or they have less emittance than other of the similar industry, that should be a criteria that you could insert. So for example, for us, we have a combined heat and power facility that's 63 megawatts on that site that supplies all the steam and hot water and mostly electricity to that US steel plant, which is the second largest plant in the United States, actually, and it produced 180,000 less tons of CO2 compared to other plants that are similar, that have separate heat and power sources. That's just an example of something you could put in procurement where you say, what is actually your carbon output? That could be something you put in there that wasn't in there before. So that's just an idea.
Lolita, I want to stick with you for just a minute because I'm kind of intrigued with this idea of local levers. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you a little bit about in your discussions, you were talking about divestment. And I think that is one of the early go-tos for cities that are thinking about their role in this economic transition. So I'm curious, New York City, this was a big announcement. Fossil fuel divestment was a big issue and it was first in the nation. You talked a little bit about the pensions and really what that is going to result in. I'm curious if you could share what were some of the lessons around working with labor, with activists, with politicians, with the private sector when getting to yes on divestment?
It was amazing, and Brett can tell you a lot of that. There was actually a case study done about this work because it was just so interesting and it took quite some time. The biggest lesson we learned is get labor involved in the discussions in the beginning. Do not bring them around at the end when you decided you want to do it, but have them in the beginning. And it happens that in New York City, there are 5 different pension fund boards, and one of them is headed by the biggest labor union. And he said, we're going to get jobs. If you put those jobs in renewable energy, we want wind turbines being built in Industry City. We want some solar panels being built in New York City. They want those jobs. They recognize if you change all the boilers, and we have a law mandating that any building above 25,000 square feet has to retrofit. By 2024, they get fines every year, not just once, every single year till they correct the condition. And because we've had benchmarking in New York City since 2007, we know what their emissions are, right? So they think they're going to get those jobs. There's a lot of buildings that are over 25,000 square feet in New York. So if you really put those levers in where people have to do this work by legislation, the money's going to come in through the jobs, and they're going to be union jobs. And we were working with them to do that. So the labor people, he's the main person saying we have to divest because we need that money for other things. It was amazing how it came together.
That's really helpful. And I know that I would like to maybe follow up with you and talk about that a little bit more, because again, I think it's a very tangible thing that cities can do that really kind of straddle between local projects and having broader implications. I want to, you're having a successful webinar when people are actually asking questions. So I want to pick up one from our audience, and then I have one more that I really want to get to. So there is this interesting question about what types of green trade or financial institutions should local jurisdictions be helping set up to promote green infrastructure efforts. So maybe that's a question that I can lob to both of you, and you can wrestle for it if you have ideas.
Sure. Lolita, do you have any thoughts to begin with?
I don't. The one thing that I had as an idea a long time ago when I was still with the mayor's office, I said, there should be in every city that has this as an issue, have the philanthropists, the business people, the largest sort of entity that brings together businesses and the city government come together to discuss these things. What do we need as a city by 2050 to make sure we get to our goals? And how are we going to get there? The private sector can't do it by themselves. Public sector doesn't have any money because of COVID, right? So you're going to need philanthropy needs to kick in. Everybody coming together to do that. So having that sort of 1 or 2 day workshopping to talk about it so that everybody comes with that, and labor, I'm sorry, that's the other entity, maybe even universities, but have all the key stakeholders in the city come together to have this exact discussion, because if it's just me doing it, I'm not going to remember everything or think of the right things. You need everybody to come together and discuss this. That's what I've always said should probably happen.
Great. Yeah, I'll just add really quickly. It might be, some of you guys might be interested in sort of catching up with the public banking movement, which seems to be gathering some real steam now. Quite a few cities, I mean, as you know, it's been an effort that's been underway, a movement toward the establishment of more and more public banks that more or less sort of follow the Bank of North Dakota model. And some of the efforts have been sort of launched citywide, others statewide. Los Angeles has been ahead of the curve of late. San Francisco has been as well. There's a very lively public banking group here in New York City where I am and where Lolita used to be, and I'm involved with them. But there are lots of similar movements in lots of other towns and cities across the country between the coast. It's not just a coastal thing. And so Boulder might be interested in sort of basically catching up with where things are or updating on where things are in that movement more broadly, because it does seem to be finally kind of bearing fruit. And it's beginning to look as though we might have a sizable number of public banks before very long now. Bank of North Dakota has been the only one for a long time, and its model is absolutely fantastic. It's unbelievably productive. It's unbelievably prudent as a lender, and yet all the loans pan out, and it ends up being quite good for North Dakota. And it's noteworthy that North Dakota is a red state, but that's one blue institution. It's actually kind of a pre-red and blue institution. It's almost more like a kind of agrarian socialist antecedent institution that is very popular, even among Republicans in North Dakota. So that's maybe just a clue for the future.
That's helpful. So I know we're getting close on time, but I'm going to ask one more question. I know Senator Fenberg is here, but I'm going to ask one more. And I'm going to dive a little bit deep, but it's a really important one, I think, for us to be thinking about. And I guess I would say, Robert, maybe this is for you, maybe it's for both of you. We'll see. So, over the course of the last year, we saw the Federal Reserve highlight local governments as a key source of employment and identify that they're particularly vulnerable in this pandemic-related economic downturn. The Municipal Liquidity Facility, which is the emergency fund designed to help local governments, was pretty much untouched. So the climate crisis is undoubtedly going to be hard on local government budgets. In fact, it's what led the city of Boulder, along with Boulder County and San Miguel counties, to sue Exxon and Suncor for expenses resulting from climate change. So when I think about this, I mean, one question would be, what should the federal government do to mitigate that? But I'm more interested in what can we as cities best advocate for in terms of those measures?
Sure. No, I'm happy to say so. I'm sure Lolita will have something here too, so I'll be quick. But so some of you guys who are familiar with sort of what I do or with what my background is might be aware of the fact that I used to work at the New York Fed and wrote a great deal about MLF when it first came out, both because it was very promising as far as its potential was concerned, and because it was spectacularly failing to live up to that particular potential. The reason for that appears to have been Steve Mnuchin. So in that sense, the primary problem is now gone. It emerged later that Mnuchin was the reason that the Fed wasn't actually using MLF in the way that it could have been used. In a nutshell, the problem with the way MLF was done was that it was administered entirely out of the New York Fed, which is the Fed where I used to work. So no disrespect intended to the New York Fed, but to think that 15 staffers in Lower Manhattan, just off of Wall Street at John, and I guess it's William and Maiden, know every problem of every locality in the country when it comes to sort of municipal finance is just absurd. It wasn't even fair to those staffers, let alone to all the cities and towns. So what I launched at the time, and what I'm still very actively pushing, and I really encourage anybody who's interested to Google this, Google the phrase "spread the Fed," and this is, I'm trying to get the Fed to go back to something more like what it was before 1935, which was a Fed in which the regional district Federal Reserve banks, Atlanta Fed, Chicago Fed, San Francisco Fed, St. Louis Fed, were very active in providing development finance for their local economies, and were there to sort of basically facilitate kind of even development across the entire country. It was effectively a kind of public development bank that was regionally sensitive, and that's why we have 12 regional Fed banks. But what happened after 1935 is we basically turned all of those into sort of glorified think tanks that have very little role in the actual financing of anything or the actual facilitation of the financing of anything. And everything is run out of the trading desk of the New York Fed right off of Wall Street. So we really have to get back to a spread Fed, I think, and start basically getting serious about things like MLF, and likewise the Main Street lending programs that were run entirely out of the Boston Fed, same problem. Spread those kinds of programs across the entire country again. That will be very helpful, I think, to localities and to startups, innovative new firms. And as you know, a lot of the startup activity that's most interesting and exciting and innovative is precisely in the environmentally friendly and environmentally sustainable space.
Yeah, terrific. That was excellent. So clearly we could spend another 2 hours on this topic with the two of you. Want to be sensitive to your time. Obviously, to those of you watching, we'll have this recording up on our website. We'll be able to tease out some excellent remarks and excellent advice that both of you have given us and those that are on this webinar, particularly the local government representatives. So if you can stay on, we would love for you to understand that you both have incredibly busy schedules. So on behalf of the city and all of us, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom today. It's been a great pleasure.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Bye, everybody.
Oh boy. Now we're going to have a little bit of whiplash, kind of switching over to more of the locally based approach, which is incredibly exciting. So the second part was really intended to kind of go from this federal lens and start thinking about, this idea of an energy transition and where the money will come from, thinking about this idea of shifting to, say, the state and the local level. And to do that, I am thrilled to be joined today by Colorado Senator Majority Leader Steve Fenberg, and hopefully someone can pop him up on the screen. There he is. Look at that. Love the technology. So, Steve, I don't know when you got here, but we just spent the last 47 minutes or so, at least my mind is a little bit blown, having this discussion with Lolita and Robert. Again, we want to drop down a bit to the state and local level. And before I do that, of course, you're just going to have to sit there uncomfortably while I introduce you. As many of you know, Steve, Senator Fenberg is one of our state's fiercest climate champions. Steve took office in 2017, and I think we all know has fought to pass aggressive carbon emissions reduction goals statewide, really working to increase investment in development of renewable energy, and of course, championing the overhaul of oil and gas regulations. A little bit of the details about Steve. He represents the 18th District of Colorado and has served as Senate Majority Leader since 2019. So some of the pieces of key climate-focused legislation that I was referring to, and let me just say, he's coming off of one of the most productive and consequential legislative sessions, at least in my recent memory, where we have seen a suite of new climate legislation passed. Steve, of course, carried a lot of these important bills. I'm just going to hit some of them really quickly, and then we're going to talk about them. Senate Bill 261, eliminating the 120% cap on solar system sizes and promoting more distributed energy resources. 272, improving Public Utilities Commission processes. 246, promoting electrification in buildings. I'm already getting tired. 260, the Transportation Funding and Modernization Bill. I do have to say that this is all in addition to the work that Steve carried on landmark healthcare legislation, mental health programs, criminal justice reform, and so importantly, gun violence prevention. So today we wanted to discuss some of this new exciting legislation, talk a bit about some of the steps Colorado can take to ensure our economy supports a clean energy future. And then just as we did with Lolita and Robert, after the discussion, we wanted to build some time for audience Q&A. So if you've just arrived, make sure if you have a question for the majority leader, use the Zoom Q&A to enter your question, and we'll be sifting through those, developing some themes, and sharing your question as we move forward. Okay, Steve, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
Always great to talk with you. I feel like a talk show host right now. I'm sorry for that. So here's my first kind of softball to you. I want to make sure that those watching are caught up on the whirlwind closing week of the state legislature, just gavelled out just over a week ago. There were some big wins for climate in there. Would you talk a little bit about some of the highlights that you see from the session, assuming that the governor signs them all? Where does that leave Colorado in terms of climate? And then what do you think is next? That's a big question, I know, but.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be a part of this discussion. I hope you don't mind that I'm downtown enjoying some coffee while we have this conversation. But I was just playing with the kid and figured I'd stop somewhere where there was Wi-Fi to be able to join all of you. But here's what we just got finished doing. In some ways, a couple of years ago, when a more progressive majority took over in the state Senate, we got a whole lot of things that were sort of pent up pieces of legislation that we've been trying to get across the finish line for some time now. The big one probably is Senate Bill 181 is one of the big ones, which is the oil and gas reforms, and really kind of changed how we think about regulating and permitting oil and gas in Colorado. The next was probably the big ticket item was the overall climate reduction goals for our state, so 1261. In some ways, like, not that those were easy fights, but in some ways those were like the big framework, overarching, I wouldn't say low-hanging fruit, but they were sort of like the obvious things we knew we needed to do once we had the majority to be able to get it done. This year, and of course there were some hiccups after we passed some of those bills because of COVID, and there was a session in between here where it was just kind of stop and go and trying to make sure the entire world didn't fall apart here in Colorado, and we had an economy after this crisis and all of that stuff. But this past session, we were working a lot on the recovery, and at the same time making sure that we didn't miss a beat when it comes to some of the climate agenda items that we wanted to focus on. So this year really was about sort of more sophisticated, more nuanced approaches to build on the frameworks that we put in place a couple of years ago. There were different approaches. We did have a big conversation, and we did end up passing a bill on narrowing in on more enforceable climate goals, greenhouse gas reduction goals for specific sectors, whether it's the industrial sector, the utility sector, et cetera. But then we also sort of went sector by sector and started implementing and passing specific programs. So it's good that we have this overall kind of economy-wide, sector by sector goals, so that our regulators know how to start chipping away at our big picture goals. But we also, we're not going to just pass an overarching bill and then call it good and see what happens in 10 years. We also need to be moving the ball forward when it comes to very specific policies that we know work. One of which is building electrification, like you talked about. It's really difficult to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the decentralized part of our economy, right? When it comes to our utilities, for better or for worse, there's only a couple of utilities, and if you pass laws that require them to do something, you start, moving towards your goals relatively quickly if you have the political support to do so. When it comes to buildings, that's much more difficult. That's about changing people's behavior and their lifestyles, and ensuring, that people are able to afford the transition to move from a fossil fuel based way of heating their homes and things like that, and moving towards more renewable electrification. So what I would say the overall picture is that we've started to get more sophisticated with our policies and go very specific to make sure that we are doing everything we can to move forward as fast as possible, making sure no other state does anything more innovative than us, because we always want to stay at the cutting edge. And a lot of that comes from the expertise and the leadership from the Boulder community. But what I would say is now we need to keep building on that. We've made a lot of progress. What we're going to have to see is ensure that there are ways to check in on our progress over the next couple of years, because we have big lofty goals for 2025, 2030, 2040, 2050. If we find out 6 months before the deadline that we're not on track, there's not much you can do. So we need to make sure we are doing these gut checks along the way, and have an accurate sense of what our emission profile is, so that we can get back on track if and when we need to. And so that's what I think a lot of the next couple of years is going to be about.
That's excellent. And so I want to pick up on that a little bit, Steve. And it's funny because I'm sitting here doing mental bingo, wondering how many times you're going to recognize somebody that walks by you. So I want to
there's some danger. There's some danger in that right now.
We're grateful to have you. I want to pick up on some of those sector-specific requirements here in a second, but one of the more interesting bills that you sponsored, 260, which was the big transportation bill, I wanted to start there because it really relates to this topic in our forum, which is the intersection of climate and our financial systems. So I think among the many things that the bill does, it raises fees on gasoline and diesel fuel. We do want to talk a little bit about the rationale behind raising the gas tax, and what are the implications that you think that fee will have ultimately on reducing gas usage and prompting a shift to electrification? And the reason that I ask that, I think, is we're seeing that the transportation sector really drives a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. So I think it's a really important place for us to be focusing some attention.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the transportation system, it's another one of those decentralized parts of our economy, right, where almost everybody has a car. People drive somewhere almost every single day. It is not easy to have one policy that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an easy, straightforward manner. And so this was a long bill. It was a complicated bill. It was a bill that took literally hundreds of hours of stakeholder meetings to accomplish. We just had the bill signed by the governor yesterday, which was super exciting. And really, it's several pieces. I mean, when it comes to transportation, there's no question there is, in every aspect of our transportation sector, there are competing interests. And interests that are, it's not like, in some of these climate discussions where the interests are simply fossil fuels versus people that want cleaner energy. It is not that simple when it comes to transportation. It is rural communities versus urban communities versus suburban communities. It is folks who really want to push forward electrification and infrastructure to accommodate electric vehicles versus folks who really just want more roads and bridges so they can drive their cars and not sit in traffic. It is folks who care a lot about the emissions impact of transportation, again, versus folks who really are looking just for more pavement. And then there's the multimodal conversation, which uses our roads, but is a different way of thinking about transportation. And so it is a complicated thicket of stakeholders that are genuinely well-meaning and reasonable. You're talking about mayors of cities and county commissioners and things like that. These aren't ideological political actors. These are people who are looking out for their community's best interests. And so it was complicated, and the entire bill is a give and take. There's no question that this is not the ideal bill for literally anybody. If I wrote the bill single-handedly and passed it, I would not have written it this way. If a Republican on the Eastern Plains wrote the bill on their own, it would definitely not look this way. And so there's something in there for everybody. And there's also, frankly, something in there that everybody is going to dislike. But it is the biggest investment in electrification in our state's history, if not maybe one of the biggest in the entire country to date. It is a massive investment in electrification. It is a large investment in multimodal transit for the state of Colorado. And then for the first time, we did a big investment in actual air quality mitigation projects to mitigate the disproportionate impact of transportation on communities of color, low-income folks, and a lot of these areas that bear the brunt of our transportation system. And then, as you said, to do all of that, we had to find funding. And in Colorado, we have a difficult funding situation with our budget and with Tabor and other restrictions. And so a lot of the money is general fund. We did kind of figure out how we can find more money in our general fund budget. But we matched it with additional revenue. And that revenue is from user fees. And this is a politically fraught conversation at the Capitol, not as fraught probably out in the real world. But our transportation system is traditionally based on user fees, meaning if you use the roads, you somehow pay for it. If you are just a single driver, and you've got a sedan, you pay your user fee through the form of the gas tax. You don't know you're paying it because when you go to the pump, the cost is what it is. But 22 cents a gallon of what you pay is a user fee. And that money goes directly towards upkeeping the roads and doing everything we need to do to keep our roads in a condition where you can drive on it. So it's generally not taxes, they're user fees. We call them a tax sometimes, but they're technically a fee. So one of the pieces that is in this bill, like you mentioned, Jonathan, is an increase to that user fee that people pay at the pump. Now, it's interesting because your question frames it around, why did you settle on increasing the gas fee? And is it about, you're sort of insinuating that it's about behavioral change. Mm-hmm. And we know that the more expensive you make something, and if you truly account for the externalities and the cost on a society, people will then it'll sort of right size itself theoretically, right? If you charge for the cost of carbon rather than putting it on all of us indirectly as a society. To be totally honest, that was a lot of the stakeholders that were part of this conversation. That's where folks wanted to go. But to be totally frank, that's not really where we ended up, because the increase in the gas fee is a couple of pennies. Over the course of 10 years, it actually is only 8 cents a gallon increase. I don't think that's significant enough to change behavior in a large way. But here's the reason why we did it. And it's because our roads are generally funded by the gas fee, it's a user fee. It is not kept up with inflation. We have not increased the gas fee for 30 years in Colorado. Many other states, including the progressive bastion of Utah, has increased their gas tax significantly, and they have amazing roads and infrastructure because of it. We have not done that in Colorado in 30 years. And so not only have we not increased the revenue from this user fee base, but we actually have lost buying power because of inflation over 30 years. So if we would have allowed it to increase with inflation, that 22 cents a gallon would be about 44 cents a gallon. We would have twice as much revenue than if we just simply allowed it to go up with inflation. So that, we have this problem where we want to invest more money into roads to modernize our transportation system. When I say roads, I just mean transportation infrastructure overall and what the future use of our roads will be. But at the same time, we are telling people we want you to buy an electric vehicle and use less gas. But the source of our funding is when people buy gas. And so we have this inherent problem. We could, double the gas fee or triple it and say we're doing this because we want people to use less of it. But it actually is counterproductive in the immediate term for modernizing our infrastructure, because then we would have less revenue. So we increased it a little bit to keep up with inflation. But actually the source of the revenue that makes the most sense and makes the most difference over time is that we are capturing how people use the roads today versus how they used it 30 years ago. And by that, I mean, there's now a fee on Amazon deliveries, on Uber rides, on Postmates, on rental cars, or even car sharing. And that is how we use transportation today, right? It's not just about getting in your car and driving to Denver. It's about all these different ways that we rely on our transportation system. And one of them, which environmentalists, including myself, fought against for years, was increasing the registration fee on an electric vehicle, because we never wanted to make electric vehicles more expensive, because we want more people to purchase them and use them. But we're getting soon to a point in the near future where we are going to have to transition our user fee that we generate to build our roads and create multimodal transit options, et cetera. We're going to have to go from the gas fee to the fact that people are going to buy electric vehicles that use zero gas. And so we need to make up that revenue difference somewhere. And that's a lot of what this bill is about. I wish I could say it's going to be transformative in changing behaviors. I think in a lot of ways, the behavior changes have already started and are coming. And we need to figure out how our transportation system fits in with those behavioral changes that we know are coming. And one of the biggest impacts that I think this bill is going to have is on the electrification side of things. This is going to be a massive investment in electric vehicle infrastructure, electrifying fleets, whether it's buses, garbage trucks, city vehicles, state vehicles. There's even going to be programs for businesses and organizations to apply for funds to electrify their own fleets. And I really do think in the next 5 years, electric vehicles are going to have such an impact that it's going to be kind of mind-blowing. And I'm really grateful that this bill is going to set us up for that transition better than maybe any other state in the country right now.
Steve, I really appreciated that explanation. It was incredibly thorough, and it actually really helps me personally understand, and it I think illuminates a really great nexus with 1266-2, and I think they're very complementary of one another then. So, this idea of the driving motivation behind the bill in terms of revenue generation versus disincenting behaviors, I think is something we all face, particularly at the local level. We're facing it with our own local carbon tax, right? So we think about how we fund our local programs. And so do you drive towards trying to disincent certain behaviors, or is it really just to generate revenue so then you can design and implement strategies? And so that's where I wanted to pick up, I think, on this nexus with 1266, which I'm sure a lot of people are really interested to hear about. And that's where you started some of your conversations about mandating emission reductions for the gas, electricity, and manufacturing sectors under a specific timetable. Early on, it seemed like those in opposition to the bill were pretty wary of economy-wide mandates. And so we're looking at 80% reduction by every electric utility that's not already required to file a plan, 60% reduction by the oil and gas industry, that's significant, 20% reduction by the industrial and manufacturing sectors. Of course, this other piece that was brought in, allowing the commission to track and enforce emissions reductions, oil and gas, electricity, manufacturing sectors, creating that environmental justice ombudsman position to field the complaints related to pollution impacts on vulnerable communities. A lot of really good stuff that I think many of us assuming we were going to lose as that bill evolved. I'm curious if you could talk a bit about why the legislature ultimately endorsed that approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, the legislature obviously is not by any means monolithic. There are a million opinions. There are 35 senators, and there's definitely more than 35 opinions on this. So the people are even conflicted within themselves sometimes on this topic. But, we sort of broke the seal with 1261 a couple of years ago. And that was the bill that really set the general framework for carbon reduction goals over time. But we felt that we needed something more enforceable, something more accountable, and something that was a little more sector by sector specific. And so that's really what this was. The previous form of this bill obviously was Senate Bill 200, if folks were tracking it. And there was a lot of conversation, a lot of negotiations, a lot of late nights with some industry folks, but also with the governor's office and others. To really get Senate Bill 200, the original intent, to a place that the governor was comfortable with, that was workable, that we thought provided the right tools for the Air Quality Control Commission and other areas, and to really get a very significant piece done when it comes to these goals that are enforceable over time. I think most of the Democrats, at least, were on board with it. But in the Senate, it's a tight margin. We can only lose 2 Democrats on our side and still be able to pass something if we don't get any Republican support. And I think we did get 1 Republican to support this bill. But then there's this other conversation about environmental justice. And that has been a really important conversation this year in the legislature. We saw an opportunity to really merge, just pure sector by sector, sort of geeky, carbon emission conversation with something that really is a little more human-centered about a lot of the communities that are negatively impacted by air quality and carbon emissions, et cetera. And so I think the marrying of those 2 concepts is really important because they clearly go hand in hand. And it sort of rights some of the wrongs of the environmental movement, I would say, over the last several decades, where we just sort of plow ahead without including everybody in the conversation that is impacted. And that really shaped the bill and the drive for it. The bill is sector by sector. There were a lot of conversations about, should it be economy-wide? Should it include all the major sectors, just the big ones? And where we ended is that it basically includes everything that was originally in 200, except buildings and transportation. And that's not because we don't think it's important. It's because we do think it's important, but there were other pieces of legislation moving forward. And it's also, frankly, like we were saying at the beginning of the conversation, it's harder to enforce. If you have a goal for emissions from people's homes and you're not on track to meet it, it's more difficult to enforce that. I mean, I'm not sure I don't think we're gonna go door by door and check everyone's light bulbs and things like that. Obviously nobody was proposing that, but it's more difficult when the government doesn't, control that sector itself. So there were other bills in the mix that all got passed that will address those pieces. So there's a lot of environmental climate reduction pieces of Senate Bill 260, the transportation bill, like we were talking. There's also the build and electrification bill, which I carried, which I think is going to be big for removing fossil fuel, water and space heating from homes and replacing it with high efficiency electrification options. There's also a benchmarking bill to make sure commercial buildings especially are getting more efficient and having fewer emissions over time. So there are several areas. I think naturally it makes sense that parts of our economy can be regulatory heavy and other parts are going to have to be a little bit more incentive based. And there is no right answer. And there's often, I think, in these academic circles around climate and policy, there are debates over, should you do cap and trade or should you do different types of approaches, right? Should it be incentive based? Should it be mandates? I don't know that the answer has to be just one. I think it absolutely has to be all of the above, dependent on the sector, dependent on the politics, dependent on the community you're in. I think there are a lot of different aspects that need to be thought about when you decide what policy prescription is right to get to the end goal the fastest, and to keep political will, right? I mean, these are touchy things, and you're sometimes talking about behavioral change. You don't want to do something that actually backfires and sets us back over time. I think that's another important aspect.
Completely fair point. And so with that, then let me ask you this question, Steve. And this is all in the world according to Steve. And so, when we look at the big changes needed in our financial systems, namely shifting our economy away from fossil fuels and into adaptation, mitigation, and a just transition, we talk a lot about what cities can do to drive those changes. And one of the questions that we have seen asked, and love to just kind of hear your thoughts on, is, well, maybe it's a question of whether you believe it's more important for communities to focus our resources on kind of decentralized actions, individual actions, things that we can control at the local level, or how would you think about that pairing with one of the things that we're really trying to drive here in Boulder, that idea of systems level change? And the reason that I ask the question is that all of our cities have limited resources. We have limited time. And so as my colleague Leah Yancey at Boulder County is pointing out with this question, we have to choose our actions fairly thoughtfully, and we have to make sure that we're resourcing our approaches. And so I'm just curious, as you think about what the most powerful levers that we ought to be pulling at the local level, where would you tell us to resource? Is it a little bit of both? Is it we really should be leaning into some of these system level changes at the state level, or focus on what we can control at the local level? I know it's a bit of an unfair question, but again.
Yeah, can I say both? I mean, I think it's an important question. And look, I think the answer is probably different for a community like Boulder than maybe it is for other communities. And by that, I mean, I think Boulder has such an important voice on this issue at the state level that it would be a missed opportunity if Boulder became more insulated and only thought about behavioral change and individual change within the boundaries of our community. And that doesn't mean that, you know, we should be spending our community's taxpayer money on helping people in Westminster save energy. I don't mean that. I mean more like, I think the impact that the community of Boulder can have is much larger than just simply the carbon footprint of our citizens here in the city of Boulder. And I do think the system level change has to be a priority, because I think that's where Boulder has a sort of competitive advantage to have influence, whereas every community can and should, and it doesn't mean Boulder shouldn't do this, but every community can do incentive-based programs to help people, you know, replace their old water heater. Every community can do incentive-based programs to encourage people to have solar on their roof. Every city can electrify their own city-owned buildings. And all of that stuff, Boulder should continue to do it. And I know Boulder is a leader on all of that stuff and will be into the future. But Boulder, you know, whether it's the municipalization conversation over the years, whether it's influence on state policy, now the partnership with Xcel Energy, Boulder is at the table, is largely, you know, given the ability to be in the driver's seat on a lot of these conversations. And I think we have the responsibility to take advantage of that as much as possible. And so I do think systems change, and in some ways it's, you know, Boulder isn't going to change the system overnight, but Boulder can be a laboratory that shows how systems can change. And sometimes that's just as important, right? Because it's not like the city of Boulder can change the entire utility sector itself. But we have seen over the years that Boulder can provide an example of how one would change the utility sector. And that actually does spark big changes. And I know, and Xcel has said this themselves, right? You know, the Xcel has repeatedly said the city of Boulder pushed them to do things they were not comfortable doing. And that's exactly where you want them, right? Because they are not bad people, but they are a system that needs to be changed, sometimes against their will. And I think they're finding their way to actually culturally accept it and be a champion of it, in large part because of the conversations and fights with Boulder over the years. And that's okay. I think that's something to be proud of, and to count as an accomplishment. And so I think the municipalization conversations and some of the other systems level changes that Boulder has contemplated and been a part of is exactly where Boulder should be. It doesn't mean we shouldn't focus on all of the other pieces. Boulder can walk and chew gum at the same time. But we are in a unique position and we need to continue to use it. Not to mention the private sector that is in Boulder that pushes the boundaries in an immense way as well. And I think that's something we need to build upon, is how the government, community leaders, and business leaders work more hand in hand to push these systems to change much faster.
Steve, I very much appreciate that answer. It's really timely too. We just had a very, I think, deep conversation with our elected officials last week on the idea of spheres of influence and the roles of local government and how they are evolving as it relates to locally based climate action. And so this idea of systems change and this tension between where we put our resources is really front and center for a lot of communities right now. So I'm going to just ask one more question. And I want to kind of tie it back a bit to the earlier conversation. I'm not sure how much of the presentation with Robert and Lolita you were able to see, but earlier we were talking about federal spending and the Build Back Better dollars that are going to be flowing from the federal government for climate, and really talking about what local governments can do to get ready for those funds and advocate for that funding. So what would you recommend cities, Boulder and cities like Boulder, what should we be doing with respect to preparing in that way? And then what's the state doing to kind of play that space in between? What role do you think the state will be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think a lot of it we need to see exactly what the guidance is going to be, right? And we at a state level were totally in the dark for a while. We are receiving $3.8 billion from the ARPA funds directly to the state, right? That's not counting the money going to cities, counties, transit authorities, et cetera. So the overall amount is like almost, I think, $6 billion. And we didn't have guidance on how we were legally allowed to spend that money until literally like a day before the money showed up in our bank account. So the federal government is kind of building the plane while flying it at the same time, but the support and the help can be incredibly game changing. And so I think we need to make sure that we are flexible, so we're not over planning in a way that gets us stuck and can't use the funding for new innovative ideas that come up along the way. So I think that's one important piece. But the state is also providing some funds that are a little more flexible. So we actually had a state stimulus program of about $800 million before we knew ARPA was going to pass, because we knew our economy was going to need this injection. We knew there were a lot of people that needed help, and we wanted to do it right. And so we actually moved about $800 million before ARPA even passed Congress and before the money showed up. And there is some money in there for local governments to do electrification, to do investments in energy efficiency and weatherization, like all kinds of different great programs. So I would say don't only look at the federal funding that comes directly to the cities, but also look at some of the state programs that will be coming separately and different avenues for resources. But one thing I would say, and maybe a shameless plug for my bill, Senate Bill 261, that just passed, which I think does provide a lot of new avenues for distributed generation. I would say think about the types of people that haven't enjoyed the benefits of the new energy economy, and how we can use different levers, different tools, and this newfound funding to make sure that we spread the benefits much broader than we have in the past. We have, as a society and as a Boulder community, we have provided incentives, we've really tried. But in the end, you're shaving off 10, 20, 30% of an expensive investment that most people just can't justify, frankly. And so thinking about how we can sort of transform this to not just be about the traditional model of, you should make an investment on the front end on your home by installing solar so you can save money in 15 years. That's not going to be appealing to a lot of people. And so, 261 does open up some doors and some avenues in ways that we probably haven't even thought of just yet. And, the thing we've talked a lot about, Jonathan, together is how do we get, the for instance, church to install a large solar system because they want to overproduce energy and donate it to lower income folks in their community. How do we think about that from not just a faith-based, community-based perspective, but from the city as well? How do we use city property to install solar to bring down the cost and make sure the barrier of entry for folks is much lower. There are a whole lot of things like that that I think we need to not necessarily go back to the drawing board, but not only implement the same methods we've done since the Obama days. We shouldn't just reinvest into existing programs, but think about what are the new ones, what are the new mechanisms to make sure that we're deploying more renewables, reducing more emissions faster and in a more equitable manner, so that everybody can enjoy these benefits this time. So we could probably talk forever about this topic. I think there are a lot of different options. Another piece that's exciting is in one of the other bills that I worked on, the RESA, so the funding that goes specifically towards renewable energy projects. We actually carved out a lot of that money from here on out to sort of be like an equity budget. So a lot of that funding now is going to be directed specifically towards people that are in underrepresented communities and lower income folks to benefit from the RESA. And that's super exciting because sometimes when there's a big pot of money for cool, innovative energy things, only the people who are already plugged in are going to even know about it in the first place. And this is now going to be a requirement that some of these funds specifically go to communities that otherwise would have known about it or benefited from these programs.
Yeah. Well, let me just pick up on one thing that you said. We absolutely could talk about this for hours and hours. I'm going to let you get back to your coffee. I realize that we should do this every single week. We should have coffee chat with Senator Fenberg. Steve, seriously, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks so much for being here. It's always inspiring to talk to you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for everything that you're doing for this state and all of us in our own communities. Have a great weekend. Brett, I'm going to pitch it over to you to let you take it home.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Steve. Again, thank you so much. Please go have some coffee. I know it's cold. We'll buy your coffee for you.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Jonathan. So good to see you guys. Always good to chat.
Yeah. Get some rest, friend. So, and to all the rest of you, thank you for joining. Thanks to both Lolita and Robert also for their terrific remarks. Again, for those of you who didn't see last time, and for those who want the recordings from this one, they're going to be posted at the website, which we put into the chat. And also, please let folks know the next session is going to be fantastic. Kate Raworth is a globally recognized leader in helping think about what a new economy could look like. So we have her on July 23rd, again, from noon to 1:30. And we'll have, just in the same way that we've had with this one, we'll have that main stage discussion with Kate, and then there will be a local forum to discuss how these issues really land and how we can work with them here locally. So thanks, everybody. I hope we'll see you again in July, and have a good weekend.